She had lived with him her whole life and thought she knew everything about him. After his death, she decided to open a shed with a strange canopy in the yard. What she found inside should not have been discovered so late. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city or country you are watching from. The neighborhood had never been remarkable, and that was precisely why people stayed. It sat a short distance from the city center, close enough that the hum of traffic could still be felt on certain evenings, yet far enough removed to give the illusion of separation from anything urgent or demanding. The streets followed a predictable grid, lined with modest houses built decades earlier, each one bearing the quiet marks of long habitation. Lawns were trimmed, but not ornamental. Trees had grown tall enough to cast reliable shade, their roots lifting sections of sidewalk in subtle rebellion against order. There were no landmarks worth mentioning, no buildings that drew attention, no stories that circulated beyond polite exchanges over fences. It was a place where life unfolded slowly and mostly unseen. The woman's house blended into this landscape without resistance. It was neither the smallest nor the largest on the street, neither freshly painted nor visibly neglected. Its siding had faded evenly over time, softened by sun and rain into a muted neutrality. The roof had been repaired in stages rather than replaced, each patch a testament to practicality rather than aesthetics. From the outside, nothing about the house suggested significance. It did not announce the decades it had contained, the choices made within its walls, or the endurance that had shaped it. Inside, the house carried a different weight. The rooms were arranged in a way that reflected habit more than design. Furniture had been placed where it made sense years ago and had never been moved since. The floors creaked in familiar places, responding to footsteps like old companions rather than complaints. Light entered through windows that had been cleaned so many times their frames bore faint scratches, each one earned through repetition. The air held a quiet, stable scent of wood, fabric, and time. Nothing here felt temporary. The woman moved through the house carefully, not because she was afraid of falling, but because she had learned to conserve energy. Age had not made her fragile, but it had made her deliberate. Every movement was chosen rather than assumed. She knew the exact distance between the table and the wall, the precise height of each step, the way the door resisted slightly before opening fully. Her body remembered the house even when her thoughts drifted elsewhere. She did not think of herself as lonely, though she lived alone. Loneliness implied absence, and she had lived long enough to know that absence could be filled with memory as easily as with people. The house still carried the imprint of her husband in ways too subtle to articulate. It was not in photographs or personal items, most of which had been sorted away over the years. It was in the way tools were stored in the utility closet, in the alignment of chairs around the table, in the predictable order of drawers. He had been a man who believed that things should be where they belonged, not because disorder offended him, but because order reduced uncertainty. He had not been a man of explanation. When he fixed something, he fixed it thoroughly, rarely offering commentary. When he made a decision, it was usually final, not because he refused discussion, but because he had already considered the alternatives in silence. Their marriage had been built on this unspoken understanding. She trusted him without needing to know every reason. He trusted her to accept what did not require justification. The small shed at the back of the property had been his domain. It stood several paces behind the house, set apart just enough to be inconvenient in bad weather. From the beginning, it had seemed slightly disproportionate. The structure itself was modest, no larger than necessary to store tools, seasonal equipment, and the accumulation of everyday life. But above it rose a separate roof, higher and sturdier than the shed appeared to require. The roof was constructed with heavier beams, reinforced joints, and an angle designed to shed weight efficiently. It had been built with care as though it were protecting something more than the space beneath it. Neighbors had commented on it when it was new. Some had asked why he bothered, why he did not simply extend the house or build a simpler storage space. He had smiled politely and said it was better that way. The explanation had never gone further. Over time, the roof became just another feature of the yard, an oddity that lost its novelty through familiarity. During their years together, the shed had been used in the most ordinary ways. Tools were hung on hooks, boxes stacked against the walls, old furniture placed there temporarily and then forgotten. The woman had gone in and out of it countless times without thinking twice. It had smelled of oil, dust, and wood, the expected scent of a space devoted to maintenance rather than living. Nothing about it had suggested importance. When her husband died, the shed changed without physically changing at all. There was no conscious decision to avoid it. It simply became a place she no longer entered. The rest of the house had demanded her attention in the days that followed. There were arrangements to be made, people to see, decisions to finalize. The shed remained closed, not because it was locked, but because nothing compelled her to open it. Years passed in this quiet pattern. The neighborhood aged with her. Some houses changed owners, others did not. Children moved away, new families arrived, routines adjusted without drama. The woman's days settled into a rhythm defined by familiarity. She woke early, ate simply, took short walks when the weather allowed, and spent long afternoons reading or sitting in stillness. The past did not intrude aggressively. It rested nearby, accessible but contained. The shed stood untouched, its roof darkening slightly with age, but remaining sound. Occasionally, as she worked in the yard or looked out a window, her eyes would pass over it without lingering. It existed at the edge of her awareness, present, but unexamined. It was only much later, when time began to press more insistently, that the shed returned to her thoughts with any clarity. The realization did not arrive suddenly. It grew slowly, shaped by small moments that accumulated unnoticed. She found herself pausing longer when climbing stairs, resting her hand against the wall as if measuring something unseen. She noticed how often she reviewed old documents, how frequently she considered what would remain after she was gone. These thoughts were not morbid. They were practical, grounded in the understanding that life did not conclude abruptly for most people. It narrowed. One afternoon, while sorting through a drawer in the living room, she came across a set of keys she had not handled in years. They lay tangled together, dull from disuse, their purpose no longer immediately obvious. She separated them carefully, recognizing each by shape and weight, until only one remained unfamiliar in her hand. It was small, unmarked, heavier than it appeared. She knew what it belonged to before she consciously acknowledged it. The shed had not been opened since the day of the funeral. She could not remember making that decision. It had simply happened, folded into the new shape of her life. Standing there with the key resting in her palm, she understood that this avoidance had become its own form of meaning. The house around her felt unchanged, yet something within it had shifted. The silence carried a different tone, less protective and more expectant. She placed the keys back in the drawer, but the awareness remained. The shed was no longer just a structure behind the house. It was a boundary she had drawn without realizing it, separating what had been lived from what had not yet been understood. That evening, as the light faded and shadows lengthened across the yard, she stood at the kitchen window and looked toward the back of the property. The shed was partially obscured by the angle, its roof visible above the fence line, steady and unmoved. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to look at it directly, not as an extension of habit, but as an object of consideration. She did not feel fear. What she felt was a quiet unease, the kind that accompanies unfinished business rather than danger. The shed represented something deferred, a chapter left unread, not because it was forbidden, but because it had been set aside. The night passed without decision. She slept lightly, waking more than once, her thoughts returning to the same image. In the morning, the house resumed its familiar rhythm, yet the awareness did not fade. It remained, steady and patient. By the end of the day, she understood that the shed would not leave her thoughts until she acknowledged it. Whatever waited, there had waited long enough. The house that had held her life for so many years now seemed to guide her gently toward the one place she had avoided, not with urgency, but with quiet insistence. The transition felt inevitable, though she could not yet articulate why. The past had not demanded attention before. Now it did, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the calm certainty of something that had never intended to disappear. The house had outlived many moments. The shed, she realized, had been waiting to be understood. After the thought had settled, it did not loosen its grip. The shed did not intrude on her days as an obsession, but it accompanied her with the quiet persistence of something unfinished. It appeared in the pauses between actions, in the moments when her hands rested without purpose, when her eyes lingered on nothing in particular. She had learned over the years that these were the moments when truth tended to surface, not in declarations, but in repetition. Life after her husband's death had not fractured. It had narrowed. The first year had been marked by tasks that demanded attention and decisions that had to be made regardless of grief. Papers were signed, accounts adjusted, belongings sorted with a practicality that surprised her. Friends and relatives had visited, their concerns sincere but finite. Eventually, the visits stopped. The phone rang less often. The world resumed its pace, leaving her in place. What followed was not emptiness, but a quieter form of living. Days passed with minimal distinction between them. She rose early out of habit rather than necessity. Meals were prepared simply, more for sustenance than enjoyment. She maintained the house not because she expected company, but because order felt like a form of respect for the life that had been lived there. The yard was kept trimmed, the fence repaired when needed, the small routines of ownership continuing without question. Her body, however, had begun to assert itself in ways that could not be ignored. There was a stiffness in the mornings that took longer to ease, a fatigue that arrived without warning and lingered without apology. She did not speak of it to anyone. It was not illness, only time, and she had no interest in dramatizing it. Still, the awareness shaped her choices. She planned her days more carefully, allowing for rest, avoiding unnecessary exertion. The future no longer stretched outward. It curved inward, asking to be considered rather than anticipated. It was this awareness that led her to begin sorting through the house in earnest. Not a thorough cleaning, not a purge, but a deliberate examination of what remained. She approached it slowly, one room at a time, allowing herself to sit with objects before deciding their fate. Some things were easy to discard. Others demanded attention, pulling memories to the surface with surprising clarity. She found herself holding items she had not touched in years, remembering not just their origin, but the circumstances that had surrounded them. There was no urgency in the process, yet it carried a quiet weight. She understood, perhaps for the first time, that these choices were not merely about space, they were about narrative. What would remain after her was not just what she left behind, but what she chose to acknowledge. As the days passed, her awareness of the shed sharpened. It became the one place she had not addressed, the one space that remained untouched by this careful reckoning. She told herself there wasn't reason to go there. The shed contained nothing she needed. It had served its purpose long ago, and whatever remained inside could stay there without consequence. Yet the thought felt increasingly hollow. One afternoon, while resting in the living room, she noticed how the light fell across the floor, stopping just short of the hallway that led to the back door. The pattern was familiar, unchanged by season or circumstance. She had seen it countless times. But now, it seemed to suggest a boundary, a division between what had been examined and what had not. The shed lay beyond that boundary. She tried to dismiss the thought, to return to the book resting in her lap, but the words blurred together. Her mind returned to small, unremarkable details from the past. The way her husband had sometimes lingered near the shed longer than necessary, the care with which he had maintained its roof, repairing it even when the structure beneath showed little wear, the fact that he had never asked her to help with anything there, though he had accepted her assistance elsewhere without hesitation. At the time, these details had seemed insignificant. Now they began to align, not as evidence of deception, but as markers of intention. The conflict that arose within her was subtle, but persistent. She did not fear what she might find. What unsettled her was the possibility of discovering something that would reframe her understanding of the man she had lived beside for decades. Their marriage had been built on trust, but trust did not require complete knowledge. She had accepted that there were parts of him that remained his alone, just as there were parts of herself she had never fully articulated. Opening the shed felt like a challenge to that balance. It suggested a need to know where none had existed before. She delayed for several days, continuing her work inside the house, allowing the decision to mature rather than forcing it. But the delay did not bring relief. The awareness only deepened, taking on a sense of inevitability. She understood then that the choice was no longer between entering the shed or not. It was between acknowledging the question or continuing to live beside it without resolution. The moment arrived without ceremony. It was late morning, the day already warm, but not oppressive. She stood in the kitchen, washing a cup she had not yet used, her movement slow and habitual. The water ran longer than necessary. When she turned it off, the silence that followed felt deliberate, as though the house itself were waiting. She dried her hands, walked to the drawer in the living room, and removed the keys. The small, heavy one rested among the others, unremarkable in appearance, yet distinct in weight. She closed her fingers around it and felt a brief tightening in her chest, not from fear, but from recognition. The walk to the back door was measured. She paused before opening it, listening to the muted sounds of the neighborhood. A distant engine, a bird calling from somewhere unseen, the faint rustle of leaves. Ordinary sounds, grounding her in the present. Outside, the yard looked exactly as it always had. The grass was trimmed, the fence intact, the shed standing quietly in its place. Nothing marked this moment as different from any other. That, she realized, was part of what made it difficult. There was no external justification for what she was about to do. The necessity existed entirely within her. She crossed the yard slowly, her gaze fixed on the shed as it grew closer. Up close, the structure revealed its age more clearly. The wood bore fine cracks. The hinges showed a dull sheen from years of exposure. The roof, however, remained solid, its beams straight, its angles precise. It had been built with care, meant to endure. The key fit easily into the lock. She hesitated only briefly before turning it. The mechanism responded without resistance, as though it had not forgotten its purpose. The door opened with a soft creak, releasing a familiar scent of dust and old wood, layered now with something subtler, something she could not immediately identify. She stood at the threshold, allowing her eyes to adjust. The interior appeared much as she remembered it at first glance. Shelves lined the walls, boxes stacked neatly, tools hanging in orderly rows. Yet the longer she looked, the more the familiarity began to fracture. The arrangement was too precise, the space too intentional. This was not a room left to drift into disuse. It was a room that had been maintained, even curated. She stepped inside, the door closing behind her, with a muted sound that seemed louder than it should have been. The light filtering through the small window cast long shadows across the floor, revealing patterns she had never noticed before. The boards beneath her feet felt solid, unyielding, carrying her weight without complaint. For the first time since her husband's death, she felt the presence of his absence acutely. Not as grief, but as proximity. The shed was not merely a storage space. It was a continuation of something he had begun, something he had chosen not to share. As she moved deeper into the room, touching familiar objects and pausing before unfamiliar ones, she understood that the decision she had made extended beyond opening a door. She had crossed a boundary she had not known existed, stepping into a part of her shared life that had remained unspoken. The house behind her remained unchanged, holding the memories she had already examined and accepted. The shed, now open, offered no such clarity. It asked not for action, but for attention. Whatever lay ahead would not announce itself immediately. It would require patience, observation, and a willingness to reconsider what she thought she knew. The decision had been made. There was no turning back, not because the door could not be closed, but because once acknowledged, some questions refused to return to silence. The shed did not feel smaller once she was inside it. If anything, the space seemed to expand the longer she stood there, as though her attention itself altered its proportions. At first glance, everything appeared ordinary enough. The shelves held the same boxes she remembered, some labeled in her husband's careful hand, others left unmarked because their contents had once been obvious to both of them. Tools hung where they always had, aligned by size and function. A folded ladder leaned against the far wall. Nothing announced itself as strange. And yet, something was wrong. The order was too deliberate, not the practical order of daily use, where objects shift slightly over time, but a preserved order, untouched by habit. Dust lay evenly across surfaces, undisturbed by recent movement, yet nothing had collapsed into neglect. The boxes were aligned with a precision that felt measured rather than convenient. The space did not carry the casual disarray of a room that had simply been abandoned. It felt held. She moved slowly, letting her eyes travel along the walls, her mind quietly comparing memory with reality. There were items she did not recall ever purchasing or using. A set of containers made from thicker material than necessary. Metal fasteners far sturdier than anything the shed's visible structure required. Even the tools seemed different upon closer inspection, some of them specialized, their purpose unclear to her. She reached out and touched one of the shelves, brushing her fingers lightly across the wood. The dust came away easily, coating her skin with fine gray residue. The shelf itself was solid, reinforced from beneath. That, too, struck her as excessive. Her husband had been practical, never wasteful, but he had also believed in doing things once, and doing them properly. The question that now formed in her mind was no longer why the shed was built this way, but what it had been built to protect. As she took another step forward, her foot met the floor with a dull, muted sound. It was subtle, easily overlooked, but it caught her attention immediately. She shifted her weight, testing the board beneath her. The sound repeated, different from the hollow creak she expected, more restrained, as though the space below absorbed rather than echoed the impact. Her breath slowed. She told herself it was nothing, that years of disuse could alter the way wood responded. Still, she crouched slightly, placing her palm against the floor. The surface felt cool and firm, more so than the surrounding boards. She pressed again, harder this time, and felt a faint resistance that did not align with the shed's simple construction. She straightened slowly, her pulse quickening, not from fear, but from recognition. This was not a place altered by chance. She began to move things aside, carefully, deliberately. Each box was lifted and set down with care, its weight considered, its placement noted. Beneath a stack of old crates, she found boards laid more closely together than the rest, their seams tighter, their alignment too precise. They did not shift when she nudged them with her foot. They were fixed. The realization settled gradually, bringing with it a strange calm. Her husband had not simply used this shed, he had prepared it. She knelt now, ignoring the protest in her joints, and ran her fingers along the edge of one of the boards. There was a faint outline there, almost invisible beneath the dust, where the wood met metal. She brushed more dust away, revealing a narrow seam, clean and intentional. A hatch. The word formed in her mind before she fully accepted it. She sat back on her heels, studying the space before her, the implications unfolding slowly. This was not something added in haste or desperation. The craftsmanship alone spoke of planning. The hatch had been integrated into the structure, concealed beneath layers of ordinary use, hidden in plain sight. For a long moment, she did nothing. The shed was silent around her, the air unmoving. She felt no urgency to act. Instead, she allowed herself to sit with the knowledge, to let it take shape without resistance. Her first thought wasn't betrayal, it was trust. He had chosen not to tell her, but he had also chosen not to destroy what lay beneath. He had kept it, maintained it, preserved it. And now, after all these years, she was here, exactly where she had been meant to stand. The question was not whether she could open the hatch. The question was whether she should. She rose slowly, moving to the door to let in more light. The afternoon sun angled into the shed, illuminating the floor and casting sharper shadows across the space. The hatch's outline became clearer, its edges undeniable now that she knew where to look. There was no handle, no obvious mechanism. Only a subtle indentation at one corner, easily overlooked unless sought. She returned to it, her movements steady. With careful pressure, she tested the indentation. The board shifted slightly, releasing a faint click that echoed softly through the shed. She withdrew her hand, startled more by confirmation than surprise. The hatch was real. She stood there, her hand hovering just above the wood, aware that this moment marked a point of no return. Whatever lay beneath the floor had been sealed deliberately. Opening it would not simply reveal information, it would alter her understanding of the life she had lived. She thought of her husband as she had known him, his quiet routines, his patience, his refusal to explain what did not need explanation. He had never been evasive, but he had also never volunteered more than was required. She realized now that this, too, had been a form of care. He had protected her not from danger, but from burden. With a steady breath, she applied pressure again. This time, the board lifted slightly, enough to reveal a dark gap beneath. Cold air rose from it, distinct from the warmer air of the shed, carrying with it a scent she did not recognize. Not decay, not dampness. Something older, cleaner, preserved. She widened the opening carefully, lifting the hatch just enough to peer inside. Darkness greeted her, deep and unyielding, swallowing the light before it could reach any surface. She retrieved the flashlight she had brought, switching it on with a practiced motion. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the top of a ladder descending into the earth. She felt her chest tighten, not with fear, but with the weight of meaning. This was not a cellar dug in haste. The ladder was made of metal, its rungs evenly spaced, its sides anchored securely. It descended farther than she had expected, disappearing into shadow after several feet. She straightened, stepping back from the opening. The shed felt different now, smaller, as though it had surrendered its true purpose. Everything she saw above ground was no longer the focus. The significance lay beneath. She considered closing the hatch, sealing it again, pretending she had not seen it. The thought lasted only a moment. Even if she never descended, the knowledge would remain. The space below existed whether she acknowledged it or not. The silence pressed in around her, broken only by the distant sounds of the neighborhood beyond the shed walls. Cars passed somewhere far away. A voice drifted faintly on the wind. Ordinary life continued, unaware of what lay beneath this unremarkable yard. She returned to the hatch and lifted it fully, bracing it carefully against the side so it would not fall closed. The opening yawned before her, the ladder inviting without insistence. She knelt again, gripping the top rung to test its stability. It held firm. She did not descend immediately. Instead, she sat on the edge of the opening, her legs folded beneath her, and allowed herself a moment of stillness. She understood now that the shed had never been the destination. It had been a threshold. The life she had lived above ground had been honest, steady, complete in its own way. What waited below was not a contradiction of that life, but an extension of it, a dimension that had existed alongside her without her awareness. When she finally placed her foot on the first rung, it was with intention rather than hesitation. She moved slowly, her grip secure, her breathing measured. The air grew cooler as she descended, the light from above shrinking to a narrow rectangle that framed the ordinary world she was leaving behind. The ladder extended farther than she had anticipated. Each rung brought her deeper, the walls around her revealing themselves as reinforced, smooth, deliberately constructed. This was not a crude excavation. This was architecture. At the bottom, her foot met solid ground. She stepped off the ladder, turning the flashlight slowly to survey the space around her. What she saw did not align with any expectation she might have formed. The room was not small. It opened outward from the base of the ladder, its ceiling high enough that she did not feel confined. The walls were finished, the floor level. Shelving lined one side, tables another. The space was clean, dry, and unmistakably intentional. She stood there in silence, the beam of her flashlight resting on the far wall, her mind struggling not with fear, but with comprehension. This was not something discovered by accident. This was something built to endure. The shed above her remained unchanged, an ordinary structure in an ordinary yard. Beneath it, a hidden room waited patiently, holding whatever truths her husband had chosen to preserve. She had crossed another boundary now, leaving behind the familiar certainty of the surface. Ahead lay a space shaped by decisions she had not witnessed, a chapter of her shared life that had unfolded beyond her sight. She took a step forward, the sound of her footfall echoing softly in the room, and felt the full weight of the realization settle. This place had never been meant to be found casually. It had been meant to be found when the time was right. She stood still for a long moment at the base of the ladder, allowing her eyes to adjust and her thoughts to settle. The beam of the flashlight moved slowly, deliberately, as if haste might fracture something fragile, though nothing here appeared fragile at all. The space was larger than any cellar she had ever known, broader and more carefully proportioned. It did not press in on her. It did not threaten. Instead, it waited. The air was cool but not damp. It carried no scent of rot or earth, only a faint trace of oil and aged wood, the smell of things preserved rather than abandoned. The walls were smooth, reinforced, their surfaces bearing the marks of age without surrendering to it. This was not a place dug quickly or reluctantly. It was a place finished. She took a step forward, then another, listening to the sound of her own movement. Her footsteps echoed softly, confirming the solidity of the floor beneath her. The echo did not linger. It was absorbed, controlled, as if the room itself had been designed to remain quiet. Even sound here seemed intentional. As she moved deeper, the layout revealed itself gradually. Shelving units lined one wall from end to end, their construction simple but precise. The shelves were evenly spaced, anchored securely, bearing boxes and containers arranged with care. A long table stood near the center of the room, its surface clear except for a few neatly stacked items placed at one corner. Chairs were positioned nearby, not casually, but as though they had been used and then returned to their place. She lowered herself into one of them, surprised by how steady it felt beneath her weight. The act of sitting grounded her, reminding her that despite the unfamiliarity of this place, she remained herself. An older woman in a room beneath her own yard, holding a flashlight and trying to understand the shape of a life she thought she already knew. The table bore faint scratches, marks of repeated use rather than neglect. This had been a workspace, not a hiding place in the desperate sense, but an environment intended for sustained activity. The realization unsettled her more than any fear might have. Whatever her husband had done here, he had done it patiently, over time. She rose and approached the shelves, examining the containers one by one. Some were labeled, others not. The labels were written in the same careful hand she recognized from old notes and receipts. Dates appeared on many of them, spanning years rather than weeks. This room had not been prepared in a single effort. It had evolved. She opened the first container slowly. Inside were documents, stacked neatly and bound with string. The paper was yellowed but intact, protected from moisture and decay. She lifted one carefully, reading the first few lines. They were not personal letters, nor were they mundane records. They were observations, notes written without sentiment, focused on facts, patterns, connections. She read a few pages, then set them down, her mind already racing ahead. These were not the writings of a man indulging in secrecy. They were the writings of a man documenting something he believed mattered. She moved to the next container, then the next, opening each with the same careful attention. Maps appeared among the papers, some old, some annotated. Diagrams followed, their lines precise, their annotations measured. She recognized parts of the neighborhood, landmarks she passed daily without thought. Streets, parcels of land, boundaries that had shifted over time. Beneath them, notes traced changes, transfers of ownership, developments that had erased what came before. The scope of it began to emerge slowly, too slowly to be grasped all at once. Her husband had been studying the land beneath their feet, not as property, but as history. He had traced its lineage backward, uncovering layers of ownership and use that had been overwritten by progress and bureaucracy. What had once belonged to someone else had been absorbed, repurposed, forgotten. She felt a quiet chill that had nothing to do with temperature. In one of the boxes, she found a bundle of older papers, their edges more brittle than the rest. These were not her husband's notes. The handwriting was different, older, more ornate. Letters addressed to no one she recognized. Official documents bearing seals she had never seen. References to holdings that no longer existed in any visible form. She sat again, spreading the papers across the table, arranging them instinctively into groups. Patterns began to form. Dates aligned. Names repeated. One name in particular appeared often, though always indirectly, as if deliberately avoided in full. Initials replaced it in many places, accompanied by a simple geometric mark drawn in the margins. The mark stirred something in her, though she could not have said why. It was not familiar, but it carried weight, the way a signature does. Whoever had drawn it had done so with confidence, expecting it to be understood. She reached for another container and found a set of notebooks. These, at last, were unmistakably her husband's. The covers were worn, the pages filled with his precise handwriting. She opened the first and read slowly, allowing herself to follow his thoughts as they had unfolded. He did not write of emotion. He wrote of discovery, of finding inconsistencies in land records, of noticing gaps where ownership should have been clear, of uncovering references to a man whose presence had shaped the area long before the neighborhood existed, and whose disappearance had been both sudden and thorough. Her husband wrote of restraint, of choosing not to pursue certain questions publicly, of understanding that some truths, once exposed, could not be easily contained. He wrote of responsibility, though he never used the word directly. Instead, he spoke of weight, of carrying knowledge that altered the way one moved through the world. As she read, she began to understand the nature of the room she stood in. This was not a refuge. It was not a bunker or a vault built in fear. It was a place of stewardship. The room had been constructed to protect information, to preserve continuity. It was insulated not just from the elements, but from time itself. The ventilation system hummed softly when she tested it, the sound barely perceptible, evidence of careful engineering. Lights responded when she flipped a switch, bathing the room in a steady glow that softened its edges. She moved through the space with growing familiarity, noting details she had missed at first. The way the shelves were numbered discreetly, the way the table was positioned to maximize light, the way the ladder was aligned with the center of the room, as if marking an axis rather than an entrance. Her husband had not simply stumbled into this role, he had accepted it. One section of the room appeared set apart from the rest. The shelving there was heavier, the containers more secure. She approached it slowly, aware that this might represent a deeper layer of the story she was uncovering. She opened one of the containers and found more documents, these sealed and formal. Legal language filled the pages, dense and exacting. She did not understand all of it, but enough emerged to clarify the shape of what lay beneath their yard. This land had once been part of something far larger. The man whose initials appeared throughout the archive had owned not just this parcel, but vast holdings that extended well beyond the boundaries of the modern neighborhood. Industries, properties, enterprises that had shaped the region's growth had once traced back to him. And then he had vanished. Not died, at least not publicly. There was no record of his death, no transfer of wealth recorded in the usual ways. Instead, there was silence. Assets dissolved into trusts. Properties were abandoned strategically. Ownership passed through intermediaries until the origin was obscured. Her husband had not created this disappearance. He had uncovered it. The room, she now realized, predated him. The reinforced walls, the integrated systems, the precision of its construction all pointed to an earlier origin. He had not built it from nothing. He had found it, recognized its purpose, and chosen to maintain it. That choice carried more weight than any action he might have taken. He could have exposed what he found, sought profit or recognition. Instead, he had preserved it, adding his own layer of documentation, his own effort, his own silence. She closed the notebook slowly, feeling a quiet ache settle in her chest. This was the part of him she had never known, not because he had hidden it out of distrust, but because it belonged to a different dimension of responsibility. He had lived above ground with her, sharing meals, routines, and ordinary concerns. Beneath that life, he had carried something heavier, something he had chosen not to burden her with until the time was right. She understood now that the time had arrived not because she was strong enough, but because there was no one else left to carry it. She moved to the far end of the room, where a small cabinet stood apart from the rest. Inside were personal items, not sentimental objects, but practical ones. A watch, a pen, a set of keys she did not recognize. They had been placed there deliberately, not stored away, but kept ready. She felt the room settle around her, its presence no longer alien. It did not demand action. It offered context. The life she had lived above ground had been honest and sufficient. The life preserved below added depth, not contradiction. When she turned back toward the ladder, she did so with reluctance, aware that leaving the room would not undo what she had learned. The knowledge would follow her, reshaping her understanding of the past in quiet, irreversible ways. She ascended slowly, emerging once again into the shed, then into the yard beyond. The late afternoon light greeted her without comment. The neighborhood remained unchanged, its calm intact. The shed door closed behind her with the same soft sound it always had. From the outside, nothing had shifted. The roof still stood solid. The yard still looked ordinary. But beneath it, a room waited, holding the accumulated weight of choices made long before she had arrived and long after she would be gone. And now she knew that her husband had not been its creator, but its guardian. The understanding followed her back into the house, settling into the spaces she knew so well, preparing her for what still lay ahead. She did not return to the room beneath the shed immediately the next day. Knowledge, once acquired, had its own gravity, and she felt its pull even as she moved through the familiar rooms of the house. The kitchen, the hallway, the living room where light fell in predictable patterns, all seemed unchanged, yet each carried a subtle difference, as if the walls themselves had absorbed what lay beneath the ground. She moved more slowly than usual, not because of fatigue, but because haste felt inappropriate. What she had uncovered did not demand speed. It demanded care. When she did descend again, it was with intention rather than curiosity. She brought with her a notebook, a pen, and the quiet resolve of someone prepared to read without flinching. The ladder welcomed her weight without protest, the room below responding with the same controlled stillness as before. This time, she did not pause to orient herself. She knew where to go. The cabinet at the far end of the room drew her attention first. The personal items inside it had lingered in her thoughts through the night, not because they were mysterious, but because they were intimate. She opened the cabinet and removed the watch, turning it over in her hands. It was older than she had realized, its casing worn smooth by years of use. The time it displayed was wrong, frozen at an hour that meant nothing to her, yet she felt certain it had once meant something to him. She set it aside carefully and took the pen next, its weight familiar, its grip shaped by the same fingers she had watched write shopping lists and notes left on the counter. The keys puzzled her most. They were not labeled, yet each was distinct, crafted for a specific purpose. She resisted the urge to test them immediately. Some answers, she sensed, should be approached through understanding rather than action. She returned to the table and reopened the notebooks she had read the day before, this time beginning where she had left off. Her husband's handwriting flowed across the pages with steady restraint. He wrote as he had lived, without embellishment, allowing facts to speak for themselves. As she read deeper, the shape of his choice became clearer. He had not stumbled upon the hidden room by accident. He had found references to it while researching the land, tracing the anomalies in ownership and documentation that had first caught his attention. At the time, the discovery had been academic, a curiosity pursued during quiet evenings. When he realized that something physical might still exist beneath the property, he had approached it cautiously, verifying, cross-referencing, confirming before ever breaking ground. His notes detailed that moment with remarkable restraint. There was no excitement recorded, no triumph, only the acknowledgement that what he had found was not simply an artifact of history, but a responsibility that extended forward. He wrote of standing where she now stood, of understanding that exposure would bring consequences he could not fully predict. The documents that followed deepened that understanding. She spread them across the table, aligning dates, comparing handwriting, tracing the path of decisions that had begun long before her own life intersected with this place. The older papers spoke of a man who had possessed extraordinary influence, not only through wealth, but through the quiet structuring of systems. He had owned land, industries, resources that fed into the growth of the city. And then, at the height of that influence, he had chosen absence. She read letters written in a hand that differed from her husband's, their language formal yet controlled. They spoke of contingency, of preparing for a future in which visibility would become a liability. The man had anticipated a time when the accumulation of wealth would attract not only admiration, but hostility, when institutions would no longer serve as protection, but as instruments of erosion. He had not fled. He had retreated. Her husband's notes acknowledged this without judgment. He did not praise the decision, nor did he condemn it. Instead, he framed it as a response to circumstance, one shaped by foresight rather than fear. The hidden room, it became clear, was not designed merely to store documents or assets. It was designed to preserve agency. Among the papers, she found the item that shifted everything from understanding to obligation. It was a sealed packet, thicker than the others, its edges reinforced, its surface marked only with the same geometric symbol she had seen throughout the archive. Her husband's handwriting appeared on the back, brief and unadorned, for when the time comes. She sat with it unopened for a long while, the weight of the packet resting against her palms. The room around her remained silent, neither urging nor resisting. She thought of her husband as he had been in the final years of his life, his movements slower, his attention more focused. She recalled moments when he had seemed distant, not withdrawn, but attentive to something beyond the immediate. Now she understood that those moments had been shaped by preparation. She broke the seal carefully, unfolding the papers within. The document was written in a clear, formal hand, distinct from both her husband's and the older texts. It did not begin with sentiment. It began with acknowledgement. The author addressed those who would come after him not as heirs, but as stewards. He wrote of the scale of what he had accumulated and of the recognition that it had grown beyond his capacity to ensure its proper use. He did not deny responsibility for that accumulation, nor did he seek absolution. Instead, he articulated the limits of control and the necessity of trust extended across time. The conditions he set forth were precise, yet not enforced through threat. There were no penalties outlined for deviation, no punishments described. The document assumed a level of discernment rather than obedience. Assets were detailed, pathways for access defined, but always accompanied by principles that framed their use. The emphasis was placed not on preservation of wealth for its own sake, but on preservation of balance. She read slowly, absorbing each clause, each carefully chosen word. The author spoke of communities shaped by absence as much as presence, of lives constrained by structures that rendered effort insufficient. He wrote of intervention not as domination, but as restoration. Wealth, in his view, was a force that required direction lest it distort everything it touched. Her husband's role in this design became unmistakable. He had not been named in the document, nor had he claimed authority over it. Instead, he had positioned himself as an intermediary, a guardian who would ensure continuity until the next steward emerged. He wrote in the margins of the document sparingly, offering context rather than commentary. His notes clarified procedures, outlined safeguards, and, most importantly, explained his silence. He wrote that he had chosen not to involve her because the knowledge would alter the shape of her days. He believed she deserved a life unburdened by choices she had not asked to make. He trusted that when the time came, she would recognize the weight without resenting it. The realization brought no anger. It brought a quiet ache, followed by understanding. She had lived a full life alongside him, not diminished by what he had withheld, but protected by it. Now that life had reached a point where protection no longer served its purpose, what remained was choice. She closed the document and leaned back in the chair, allowing herself to breathe fully for the first time since descending. The inheritance outlined before her was not a transfer of ownership in the traditional sense. It was an invitation to participate in a design that extended beyond personal benefit. There were resources here that could alter lives, reshape spaces, correct imbalances long accepted as inevitable. But there was also restraint built into every layer, a reminder that power, once released without direction, rarely returned to its intended course. Her thoughts turned to the neighborhood above, to the houses that lined the streets in quiet repetition. She thought of the people who lived there, the routines they followed, the struggles that remained invisible behind closed doors. She thought of her own life, of the modest ambitions she and her husband had shared, of the satisfaction they had found in stability rather than excess. The inheritance did not contradict that life. It extended it. She understood now that the room beneath the shed was not a secret meant to be unveiled, nor a treasure meant to be claimed. It was a threshold designed to test readiness rather than curiosity. The man who had built it had trusted time more than institutions. Her husband had trusted her more than circumstance. She gathered the documents carefully, returning them to their places with renewed respect. The packet was resealed and placed back where it belonged, not hidden, but set apart. The watch, the pen, the keys were returned to the cabinet, their significance clearer now than ever before. When she rose to leave, she did so with steadiness. The ladder felt familiar beneath her hands, the ascent measured and unhurried. Emerging into the shed, she paused only briefly before closing the hatch, restoring the floor to its unassuming appearance. The act did not feel like concealment. It felt like preservation. Outside, the afternoon had shifted toward evening. The light softened, the air cooling slightly as the neighborhood settled into its habitual quiet. She closed the shed door and stood for a moment in the yard, listening to the distant sounds of ordinary life, continuing without awareness of what lay beneath. The inheritance she carried did not announce itself. It did not demand immediate action. It asked only that she acknowledge it fully and decide, in her own time, what it should become. As she returned to the house, the path ahead did not feel overwhelming. It felt defined. The absence of a name did not diminish the inheritance, it clarified it. What had been left behind was not meant to elevate a lineage or secure remembrance. It was meant to endure through use, guided by restraint. The understanding settled into her with surprising gentleness. She had not been chosen by chance. She had been chosen by readiness. She did not descend into the room beneath the shed the following morning. The knowledge she carried no longer pressed urgently against her thoughts, demanding attention. Instead, it settled into her with a steady, grounding weight, like something that had finally found its proper place. For the first time in many years, she woke without the faint sense of unfinished business that had accompanied her days. The house greeted her as it always had, but she moved through it differently now, with an awareness that extended beyond walls and rooms, beyond the visible boundaries of her life. The neighborhood woke slowly around her. Doors opened, engines started, footsteps crossed driveways. Ordinary sounds marked the passage of another day. She watched them from the kitchen window, her hands resting on the edge of the counter, her thoughts moving quietly. Nothing above ground had changed. The houses remained modest, the street unremarkable, the rhythms familiar. Yet she knew that the meaning of this place had shifted irrevocably for her. The land beneath her feet was no longer just a foundation. It was a continuation. She spent the morning attending to small tasks, not because they required attention, but because routine offered clarity. She watered the plants along the fence, repaired a loose hinge on a cabinet door, sorted a stack of old paper she had set aside weeks earlier. Each action felt deliberate, measured against a new understanding of time. She was no longer simply passing through her days. She was preparing. As the afternoon approached, she returned to the shed, not with uncertainty, but with familiarity. The structure stood unchanged, its roof still bearing the marks of careful construction, its presence quiet and unassuming. She unlocked the door and stepped inside, the space greeting her without resistance. This time, she did not pause to observe the ordinary contents. Her movements were purposeful, guided by memory rather than discovery. She opened the hatch and descended once more into the room below. The space welcomed her as it had before, its order intact, its silence steady. She did not sit immediately. Instead, she walked the perimeter slowly, her hand trailing along the reinforced walls, feeling the solidity of what had been built. This place had been designed to outlast not only its creator, but its first guardian as well. Now it belonged to her, not as possession, but as charge. She reviewed the documents again, not searching for revelation, but for orientation. The principles outlined in the inheritance document no longer felt abstract. They aligned with her own instincts, shaped by a lifetime of restraint and observation. She had never sought prominence. She had never been drawn to accumulation for its own sake. The idea that wealth could exist without spectacle, that influence could be exercised quietly, resonated deeply with her. The question before her was not whether to act, but how. She understood that there was no requirement to reveal what lay beneath the shed. Exposure, she sensed, would undermine the very balance the original architect of this design had sought to preserve. The power of what had been hidden lay in its discretion, in its ability to function without drawing attention. She had no desire to alter that. At the same time, inaction felt equally inappropriate. The inheritance was not meant to remain inert. It was meant to move, to shape, to restore where erosion had occurred. The documents made that clear, not through demand, but through expectation. She returned to the surface later that afternoon, sealing the hatch with the same care she had learned to apply to every other decision. The shed resumed its role as an ordinary structure, its purpose concealed not through deception, but through humility. She locked the door and stood for a moment in the yard, looking at the house, the fence, the trees that had grown alongside her life. Everything remained exactly as it had been, and yet she felt an unfamiliar sense of alignment, as though disparate parts of her existence had finally resolved into a coherent whole. In the days that followed, she began to make decisions quietly. She did not consult newspapers or officials. She did not announce her intentions to friends or neighbors. Instead, she sought counsel discreetly, framing her questions in hypothetical terms, drawing on professionals whose integrity she could assess without revealing the full scope of her circumstances. Legal structures were discussed, not as instruments of control, but as safeguards against misuse. Trusts were outlined that emphasized continuity rather than authority, oversight rather than dominance. She took her time. There was no urgency imposed by age, no fear that time would run out before the work could begin. The design beneath her feet had waited decades without faltering. It could wait a little longer. Her thoughts often returned to her husband during this period, not with regret, but with appreciation. She understood now the discipline his silence had required, the care with which he had balanced knowledge and restraint. His life above ground had been modest by choice, not limitation. Beneath that modesty had existed a depth of responsibility he had carried alone until he no longer could. She did not feel abandoned by that choice. She felt honored by its conclusion. Gradually, her plans took shape, not in detail, but in direction. She identified areas where intervention could occur without disruption, where support could strengthen rather than replace existing efforts. Housing emerged as an obvious starting point. She had lived long enough to understand the stabilizing power of a secure home, the way it allowed everything else to take root. Yet she rejected the notion of grand development. The neighborhoods that had endured neglect did not need transformation. They needed repair. Education followed naturally, not institutions alone, but pathways. Programs that addressed continuity rather than access alone, recognizing that opportunity lost through instability was rarely recovered. She envisioned support systems that accompanied individuals through transitions, not as benefactors, but as partners. Employment, too, took on a different shape in her mind. She did not think in terms of jobs created, but of capacities restored. Small enterprises rooted in their communities denied resources not because of lack of merit, but because of structural oversight. These were the spaces where discrete support could have lasting effect. Throughout this process, she remained mindful of the inheritance document's caution against spectacle. She chose anonymity not out of fear, but out of fidelity to purpose. Recognition, she understood, altered motivation. She wanted the work to endure beyond her involvement, to become embedded rather than dependent. The house above the hidden room began to change in subtle ways, not in appearance, but in function. She rearranged one of the larger rooms, removing furniture that had grown unnecessary, opening the space. It became a place for conversation, for quiet collaboration. The original blueprints she had studied in the underground room returned to her thoughts, not as instructions for a structure to be built, but as a philosophy of space. A house was not meant to isolate, it was meant to connect. She considered the possibility that the room beneath the shed might someday need another guardian. The thought did not trouble her. She began to document what she had learned, not in exhaustive detail, but with enough clarity to guide someone else when the time came. She did not assume who that person might be. The design had never depended on certainty. It depended on readiness. Her own life settled into a new rhythm. The urgency of sorting and preparation gave way to steadiness. She found that she slept more deeply, waking with a sense of purpose that did not demand articulation. The future no longer felt abstract or distant. It felt present, shaped by choices she was already making. The shed remained untouched outwardly. Its roof continued to weather, its boards to age. Neighbors passed it without comment, seeing nothing but a practical outbuilding. She sometimes stood beside it in the early evening, remembering the moment she had first recognized it as a boundary rather than a structure. The memory did not bring sorrow. It brought clarity. She understood now that silence was not absence. It was space. The room beneath her yard did not need to be filled with people or noise to fulfill its purpose. It needed only to remain intact, both physically and philosophically. It was a reminder that some designs were meant to operate beneath the surface, shaping outcomes without demanding acknowledgement. As time passed, the effects of her decisions began to manifest quietly. Projects stabilized. Partnerships formed. Support reached places it hadn't before, without fanfare or attribution. She observed these developments from a distance, resisting the impulse to intervene unnecessarily. The measure of success, she believed, was sustainability without supervision. Her own role gradually diminished, not through withdrawal, but through completion. Systems she had helped establish no longer required her input. That, she recognized, was the truest validation of the inheritance's design. The house, the shed, the hidden room beneath them all remained. They formed a continuum rather than a hierarchy, each layer supporting the next. Past and future met there, not in conflict, but in alignment. In her final years, she did not wonder what legacy she would leave. The question no longer felt relevant. Legacy implied recognition, a marker left behind. What mattered to her now was continuity, the quiet assurance that what had been entrusted to her would persist without her. On evenings when the light softened and the neighborhood settled into its familiar calm, she would sit by the window and watch the ordinary world continue. She felt no urge to reveal what lay beneath that ordinariness. Some truths gained strength from remaining unspoken. The silence that remained was not empty. It was full of intention, of work done without display, of responsibility carried forward without name. The shed stood as it always had, modest and overlooked. Beneath it, the room waited, not for discovery, but for continuation. And above it, the house held a life that had come full circle, grounded not in what had been found, but in what had been understood. The land that had once seemed unremarkable had fulfilled its purpose. It had waited. It had revealed itself. And in doing so, it had transformed the meaning of inheritance, not as possession, but as stewardship passed quietly from one life to the next. If this story stayed with you until the end, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. More powerful stories, hidden truths, and quiet discoveries are already waiting in our upcoming videos. Watch the next video now to continue the journey. And if this story meant something to you, share it with someone who loves stories that leave a lasting mark.